The morning of July 10, 1943, Lieutenant Howard Cruz tightened his harness straps inside the cramped cockpit of his TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga rocking gently beneath him in the waters off New Georgia. His radio man and gunner were already settled in behind him, running through their pre-flight checks with the mechanical efficiency that came from months of training. But training hadn't prepared them for what Cruz was about to attempt. The intelligence briefing 2 hours earlier had been clear. A Japanese cruiser, the Jintsu, was operating in Kula Gulf with a destroyer screen, threatening American positions in the Solomon Islands. Standard torpedo attack doctrine called for release altitude of 150 feet, approach distance of 3,000 yards, giving the Mark 13 torpedo time to stabilize after water entry. The Navy had finally fixed most of the Mark 13's problems by mid-1943. The weapon no longer ran too deep or failed to detonate 2 times out of 3, but it still had one critical limitation. At standard release parameters, a maneuvering warship could spot the torpedo track and simply turn away. Cruisers could hit 33 knots. That gave them enough speed to avoid torpedoes they saw coming. Cruz had been thinking about this problem for weeks. He'd studied after-action reports from the Coral Sea, from Midway, from every torpedo attack in the Pacific War so far. The pattern was consistent. High-altitude drops gave targets too much warning. By the time the torpedo entered the water, leveled out, and started its run, the enemy ship had precious seconds to maneuver. What if you eliminated those seconds? What if you dropped so low that the torpedo hit the water already pointed at the target, already at running depth, already committed to its trajectory before the enemy even knew you were there? The problem was that dropping at 50 feet violated every safety protocol in the Navy's torpedo bombing manual. At that altitude, you were inside the blast radius of your own weapon if it detonated prematurely. You had zero margin for pilot error. If you misjudged your height by even 20 feet and went too low, your propeller would clip the water and you'd cartwheel into the ocean at 140 miles per hour. If you pulled up too soon, the torpedo would skip off the surface like a stone, rendering it useless, and you had to fly straight and level through anti-aircraft fire with no room for evasive maneuvers, because the slightest turn would throw off your torpedo's trajectory. Cruz had tried to explain his theory to the squadron commander. The commander had listened politely and told him to stick to standard doctrine. The Navy had procedures for a reason, and those procedures were written in the blood of pilots who'd tried to freelance their tactics and died for it. But the commander hadn't forbidden low-altitude drops explicitly. He'd just strongly advised against them. That left Cruz with a choice: follow the doctrine that wasn't working, or try something that might get him killed but might actually sink the target. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of torpedo delivery seemed straightforward on paper, but were brutally unforgiving in practice. When you released a Mark 13 torpedo from 150 feet at 140 miles per hour, the weapon underwent a violent entry sequence. It hit the water at roughly 205 feet per second, penetrated the surface, and dove immediately. The torpedo's gyroscope and depth control mechanism needed approximately 200 yards of travel to stabilize the weapon, bring it back up to its preset running depth of about 12 feet, and get it on course. During those 200 yards, the torpedo was essentially out of control. It might be diving to 40 feet, it might be porpoising up and down. It definitely wasn't going in a straight line toward anything. That 200-yard stabilization distance meant you needed to release from at least 600 yards out from the target, preferably farther, to give the torpedo time to settle into its attack run. Standard doctrine called for release at 3,000 yards, which gave you a comfortable safety margin and made the mathematics manageable. But 3,000 yards also gave the target's lookouts roughly 20 seconds from torpedo splash to potential impact. 20 seconds was an eternity in naval combat. A cruiser traveling at 33 knots covered about 330 yards in those 20 seconds. If the ship's captain saw the torpedo wake and ordered a hard turn the moment the weapon entered the water, the cruiser could present its narrow bow profile to the torpedo, reducing the target area from 300 feet of broadside to maybe 40 feet of bow. The torpedo's chance of hitting dropped from 60% to maybe 15%. Every torpedo pilot in the Pacific had experienced this frustration. You'd make your approach, dodge anti-aircraft fire, survive the gauntlet of tracers and exploding shells, release your torpedo perfectly, and watch the target simply turn away. The torpedo would pass harmlessly behind the ship's stern or run out of fuel trying to chase a target that was faster and more maneuverable. It was demoralizing. You'd risked your life and accomplished nothing. The Japanese had learned this defensive technique early in the war. Their lookouts were trained to watch for the distinctive splash of torpedo water entry. The moment they saw it, they'd alert the bridge. The captain would order full rudder and maximum speed. Japanese cruiser captains had gotten so good at this that by mid-1943, American torpedo bombers were achieving hit rates below 20% in daylight. Attacks against major warships. 20% meant you needed to send 5 aircraft to get 1 hit, 5 aircrews risking their lives, 5 torpedoes expended, and 4 of them accomplishing nothing. The Navy was losing aircraft faster than they could be replaced, and torpedo squadrons were being worn down through attrition even when they weren't facing catastrophic losses like the Devastator squadrons at Midway. Crews understood that the only way to fix this problem was to eliminate the target's reaction time. If you could get the torpedo in the water closer to the target, running true and on course immediately instead of after a 200-yard stabilization period, the enemy wouldn't have time to maneuver. But that meant dropping from an altitude where the torpedo didn't need to stabilize. That meant dropping at 50 feet or less. The physics were dangerous but theoretically sound. A Mark 13 released at 50 feet would enter the water at a much shallower angle than one released at 150 feet. The reduced impact velocity meant less violent water entry, less depth penetration, faster stabilization. If you did it right, the torpedo would enter the water, dive maybe 10 feet, level out almost immediately, and start its run while still within 200 yards of the release point. That gave you effective range of maybe 800 yards from release to impact. Close enough that the target would have perhaps 5 seconds of warning instead of 20. 5 seconds wasn't enough time for a cruiser to meaningfully maneuver. The captain might start his turn, but the torpedo would be on him before the rudder could bring the ship around. It was the difference between a theoretical shot and a practical certainty. But 50 feet was terrifying. Avenger pilots trained to maintain 150 feet minimum altitude during attack runs. That gave you some margin for error, some room to recover if you hit turbulence or misjudged your height. Feet. The margin disappeared. You were essentially flying at masthead height over the ocean, threading between the ship's superstructure and the water, with anti-aircraft tracers converging on your position from every direction. The other problem was blast radius. The Mark 13 carried 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, roughly 25% more powerful than TNT. When that warhead detonated, it created a pressure wave that could travel through water for hundreds of yards. If you were too close when your torpedo hit and exploded, that pressure wave would hit your aircraft like a giant invisible hammer, potentially shredding your control surfaces or simply knocking you out of the sky. Navy calculations suggested you needed to be at least 400 yards away from the detonation to be safe. If you were releasing at 800 yards and the torpedo ran straight, that left you 400 yards of safety margin. But if anything went wrong, if the torpedo ran hot and exploded prematurely, if your navigation was off by 100 yards, you could easily end up inside the kill radius of your own weapon. Every pilot who'd thought about low-altitude tactics had done this same mental calculus. The reward was higher hit probability. The risks were collision with the water, blast damage from your own torpedo, and extended exposure to anti-aircraft fire because you couldn't release from safety range and break away. You had to fly straight into close range, essentially pointing your aircraft at the enemy and daring them to shoot you down before you could release. Most pilots looked at that equation and decided standard doctrine made more sense. You might have a lower hit rate, but you'd live to make more attacks. Crews looked at the same equation and reached a different conclusion. A 20% hit rate meant the Navy was wasting 80% of its torpedo attacks. Better to increase the danger per attack if it meant actually accomplishing the cruiser's mission. He'd practiced low-altitude approaches over empty ocean, dropping dummy torpedoes from 50 feet to get a feel for the timing and the angle. His radio man thought he was insane. His gunner had quietly asked to be reassigned to a different crew, a request the squadron commander denied. They were stuck with Cruz and his experimental tactics, whether they liked it or not. Now, sitting on Sarah's flight deck with the engine warming up and the target coordinates plotted on his navigation board, Cruz was about to find out if his theory would work in combat. The briefing officer had estimated Jintsu's position based on the most recent reconnaissance reports. The cruiser was approximately 60 miles northwest of their current position, moving south at about 20 knots. If the intelligence was accurate, Cruz would intercept the target in roughly 30 minutes. He wouldn't be alone. The strike package included 6 Avengers from his squadron, plus 8 F-6F Hellcat fighters for escort and suppression. The fighters would go in first, strafing the cruiser's anti-aircraft positions to suppress defensive fire and draw attention away from the torpedo bombers. Then the Avengers would make their runs, 3 from each side in an anvil attack pattern designed to split the cruiser's defensive fire and guarantee that at least some torpedoes would have good approach angles. Cruz planned to lead the portside element. He'd already decided he was going in at 50 feet, regardless of what the other pilots did. If it worked, if he got a hit, maybe the others would follow his example. If he got blown out of the sky, well, at least they'd know not to try it his way. The launch officer signaled. Cruz advanced the throttle, felt the Avenger surge forward, and held the stick steady as the carrier deck dropped away beneath him. The Pacific stretched out ahead, empty blue water under a clear morning sky. Somewhere out there, Jintsu was steaming south, her crew probably not even aware that 6 American torpedo bombers were about to demonstrate a new and terrifying approach to naval warfare. The concept of low-altitude torpedo attack wasn't actually new in July 1943. What was new was the idea that it could work consistently without catastrophic losses. The British had pioneered extreme low-altitude techniques during the Taranto raid in November 1940, when Fleet Air Arm Swordfish biplanes attacked Italian battleships in shallow harbour water. Those attacks required dropping from approximately 100 feet to prevent torpedoes from diving too deep and burying themselves in harbour mud. But Taranto had been a night attack against anchored ships with modified torpedoes specifically designed for shallow water entry. The technical modifications involved wooden fins and cardboard nose drums that altered the torpedo's hydrodynamics, allowing shallower dives. By 1943, American torpedo bombers were attacking maneuvering warships in open ocean during daylight. The tactical requirements were completely different. The Japanese had also experimented with low-altitude tactics, particularly during the Pearl Harbor attack. Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers had approached their targets at altitudes between 40 and 100 feet, releasing modified Type 91 torpedoes with wooden stabilizing fins that prevented deep dives in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. Those attacks achieved devastating success, sinking or crippling 8 battleships. American naval observers studying the Pearl Harbor attack noticed the low release altitudes, but attributed the success primarily to surprise and to the fact that the targets were stationary, anchored ships with no opportunity to maneuver. The assumption was that low-altitude drops worked against stationary targets, but would be suicide against maneuvering warships with alert crews and functioning anti-aircraft batteries. That assumption was reinforced by the Midway experience. 41 American torpedo bombers attacking Japanese carriers in June 1942 at low altitude had been virtually annihilated, with 35 aircraft shot down and 84 men killed. The lesson seemed clear. Low and slow meant death. Better to maintain altitude, maintain some survivability, and accept lower hit rates as the cost of keeping your crews alive. But Cruz and a handful of other innovative pilots were questioning that lesson. The devastators at Midway had been flying obsolete aircraft with a top speed of 115 miles per hour against the best-trained naval aviators in the world. The TBF Avenger could cruise at 145 miles per hour and sprint to 275 in an emergency. That extra speed mattered. It was the difference between being a stationary target and being difficult to hit. More importantly, By mid-1943, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted dramatically. The Japanese had lost their experienced carrier air groups at Midway and in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. The Zero fighters that had torn apart VT-8 and VT-6 were still dangerous, but their pilots weren't the pre-war veterans who'd trained for years. Many were replacement pilots with minimal combat experience, and their reaction times showed it. American fighter cover had also improved exponentially. The F-6F Hellcat had entered service in early 1943, and it was purpose-built to kill Zeros. Faster in a dive, better armored, with superior firepower, the Hellcat could establish air superiority over most combat zones. That meant torpedo bombers didn't have to worry as much about enemy fighters shredding them during their attack runs. The primary threat was anti-aircraft fire from the target ship itself. This was the tactical environment Cruise was operating in. Better aircraft, better fighter support, and enemy crews who were increasingly inexperienced and stretched thin. If there was ever a time to try low-altitude tactics against maneuvering targets, this was it. But knowing the theory and executing it in combat were entirely different things. Cruise maintained altitude as his flight of 6 Avengers formed up and headed northwest. The Hellcat escorts joined them, 4 fighters flying high cover and 4 more positioned to dive ahead of the torpedo bombers when they reached the target. Radio discipline was strict, no unnecessary chatter. The Japanese were known to monitor American radio frequencies, and any transmission could give away the strike package's position and heading. 20 minutes into the flight, Cruise spotted the coastline of New Georgia off his port side, the jungle-covered mountains rising dark green against the horizon. The island was contested ground, with American and Japanese forces locked in brutal infantry combat for control of Munda Airfield. Whoever controlled Munda controlled air operations over the Central Solomons, which made this one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate in the Pacific. The presence of Jintsu in these waters was the Japanese Navy's attempt to disrupt American operations, shelling coastal positions and threatening supply lines. If the cruiser wasn't stopped, it could do serious damage to the troops fighting ashore. That knowledge added weight to Cruise's decision. This wasn't just about testing new tactics. This was about protecting American soldiers who were dying in the jungle while he flew overhead. At 28 minutes into the flight, the radio crackled. One of the Hellcat pilots had spotted the target, bearing 315 degrees, range approximately 15 miles, one large warship with destroyer escorts, heading south-southwest at high speed. Cruise adjusted his course, angling to intercept. His heart rate picked up, adrenaline starting to filter into his bloodstream. This was it. The strike coordinator, flying one of the other Avengers, outlined the attack plan over the radio. Hellcats would go in first, strafing run from astern to suppress the cruiser's aft anti-aircraft batteries. Then the 6 Avengers would split into 2 3-plane elements, attacking from port and starboard simultaneously to create the anvil pattern that divided defensive fire and made it impossible for the cruiser to turn away from all the torpedoes. Cruise acknowledged the order, but said nothing about his intention to drop from 50 feet. No point starting an argument at 7,000 feet. Better to just do it and apologize later if necessary. He pushed the stick forward, beginning his descent. The altimeter unwound steadily. 6,000 feet, 4,000, 2,000, 1,000. At 800 feet he leveled out and increased speed. The Avenger's engine roared, the propeller clawing at the air. He could see Jintsu now, a grey shape against the darker blue of the Kula Gulf, her wake a white line stretching behind her. The destroyers were visible too, smaller shapes flanking the cruiser about 1,000 yards out on either side. The Hellcats went in, 4 fighters diving from 6,000 feet in a screaming high-speed pass. Their 50-caliber machine guns opened up, tracers converging on Jintsu's stern. The cruiser's anti-aircraft batteries responded immediately, pom-pom guns and 25mm machine cannon filling the sky with exploding shells and crisscrossing tracer rounds. It looked like fireworks, beautiful and deadly. Crews watched the Hellcats pull out of their dive and climb away, mission accomplished. The cruiser's aft batteries were focused on the retreating fighters, which meant the torpedo bombers would have a few seconds of reduced fire when they started their runs. He pushed the stick forward again, descending through 500 feet, 300, 200, 100. At 75 feet he leveled off, then dropped lower. 60 feet. The ocean surface was close enough now that he could see individual waves. His radio man said something over the intercom, probably an objection or a prayer, but Cruz ignored it. 50 feet. The altimeter needle hovered just above the mark. This was the altitude he'd practiced, the height where theory met reality. The other Avengers in his element were maintaining 150 feet, standard doctrine altitude. They'd probably think his altimeter had malfunctioned when they saw how low he was flying. Let them think that. He armed his torpedo, felt the weapon's release mechanism engage. His airspeed was 140 miles per hour, slightly slower than optimal but necessary to maintain control at this altitude. Jintsu was 2 miles ahead now, growing larger every second. He could see details: the cruiser's twin smokestacks, her main turrets, the superstructure bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Muzzle flashes erupted from her deck as the gunners spotted the incoming torpedo bombers and opened fire. Tracer rounds arced toward him, red and green lines reaching across the distance. 1,000 yards. He adjusted his approach angle slightly, compensating for the cruiser's movement. Jintsu was still heading south, but her captain had spotted the torpedo bombers and was starting a turn to port, trying to present a narrow bow profile to the attackers. The turn was too late. 800 yards. Close enough. Cruz pressed the release trigger. The Avenger lurched slightly as the 2,000-pound torpedo dropped away from its centerline mount. He immediately pulled back on the stick, climbing to avoid both the cruiser's defensive fire and the blast radius of his own weapon. From his rear-facing position, the radio man watched the torpedo hit the water. The splash was smaller than normal, less violent. The weapon dove shallow, maybe only 8 feet, then leveled out and started running. Its track was visible in the water, a line of disturbed surface pointing directly at Jintsu's port side amidships, 5 seconds from water entry to impact. The cruiser's captain never had time to complete his turn. The Mark 13 struck Jintsu just aft of her forward turret, below the waterline, in the most vulnerable part of the hull, where fuel bunkers and ammunition magazines were located. 600 pounds of Torpex detonated against the thin hull plating, punching through and exploding inside the ship. The detonation was catastrophic. Jintsu's forward magazine cooked off, a secondary explosion that ripped the entire bow section open. The cruiser's forward turrets collapsed into the expanding hole where the front third of the ship used to be. Water poured into the ruptured hull at an impossible rate. Within 30 seconds, the cruiser was visibly down by the bow, her forward deck already awash. Cruz didn't see the hit. He was climbing hard, jinking left and right to spoil the anti-aircraft gunner's aim, his entire focus on gaining altitude and getting clear of the defensive fire. But his radio man saw everything and described it over the intercom in a voice that mixed shock with satisfaction. "Direct hit, skipper. You blew the bow right off her." The other Avengers in the strike package released their torpedoes from standard altitude, 3,000 yards out. 2 hit, adding to Jintsu's damage. But it was already over. The cruiser was sinking rapidly, listing to port as water flooded her forward compartments. Her captain ordered abandon ship 7 minutes after Cruz's torpedo struck. By the time the American aircraft formed up and headed back toward Saratoga, Jintsu's bow was completely underwater, and her stern was rising out of the ocean at an impossible angle. The cruiser sank 13 minutes after being hit, taking 472 men with her, including her captain who chose to go down with his ship. It was one of the fastest sinkings of a major warship in the Pacific War, and it established something that would ripple through every torpedo squadron in the Navy. Low-altitude drops worked. They worked devastatingly well. You could sink a maneuvering cruiser in broad daylight with a single hit if you delivered that hit before the target had time to react. The mathematics of 50-foot drops weren't theoretical anymore. They were proven, and Howard Cruz had just rewritten the tactical manual. The after-action debriefing aboard Saratoga that evening lasted nearly 3 hours. Every pilot from the strike package sat in the ready room, while intelligence officers went through the attack frame by frame, reconstructing what had happened and why. When it came time for Cruz to explain his approach, the room went silent. He described his reasoning methodically: the problem with standard altitude drops, the target's reaction time, the mathematics of stabilization distance versus warning time, the reduced impact velocity at 50 feet, and how it affected the torpedo's entry characteristics. He showed his calculations, notes he'd been keeping for weeks about optimal release parameters for different target types and speeds. The squadron commander listened without interrupting. When Cruz finished, there was a long pause. Then the commander asked the only question that really mattered: "Can you do it again?" Cruz said yes, he could teach it. The technique wasn't complicated once you understood the principles. Maintain exactly 50 feet, hold your speed at 140 miles per hour, release at 800 yards, no closer, unless you wanted to risk blast damage. Climb immediately after release to clear the target's defensive envelope. The hard part wasn't the mechanics. The hard part was the nerve required to fly that low, that straight, directly toward a ship that was trying to kill you. Within a week, Cruz was conducting training sessions for the entire air group. He'd take pilots up over empty ocean and have them practice low-altitude approaches against friendly destroyers that were in on the exercise. The destroyers would maneuver as if under attack, and the pilots would make dry runs, simulating torpedo releases at 50 feet without actually dropping weapons. The training revealed something interesting. Most pilots could execute the technique mechanically. They could maintain altitude, hold course, judge the release point. What separated the successful attacks from the failures wasn't skill, it was psychology. Some pilots would instinctively pull up at the last moment when their hindbrains screamed that they were too low, too close, in too much danger. That instinctive pull-up would ruin the attack geometry and send the torpedo skipping off the surface or diving too steeply. The pilots who succeeded were the ones who could override that survival instinct and hold their approach even when every nerve in their body was telling them to climb. It was the same quality that separated effective fighter pilots from merely competent ones. The ability to stay committed to an action past the point where self-preservation demanded you quit. By August 1943, low-altitude torpedo tactics had spread beyond Saratoga's air group. Word traveled fast in the Pacific Fleet. Pilots talked to each other during liberty calls. Squadron commanders shared after-action reports. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics sent observers to interview Cruz and document his techniques for distribution to other carriers. The formal tactical bulletin was published in September, designated TACBUL 2-43, Distribution, All Carrier Air Groups, Pacific Fleet. The document was remarkably straightforward. It outlined optimal drop altitudes for different target types, recommended approach speeds, discussed blast radius safety margins, and included diagrams showing attack geometry. Buried in the technical language was a simple message. If you wanted to hit maneuvering targets, you needed to drop low enough that they couldn't evade. But implementing the tactic fleet-wide required more than just distributing a bulletin. It required addressing the legitimate concerns that had prevented low-altitude drops from becoming standard practice earlier. The most pressing concern was survivability. Yes, low drops increased hit probability. But did they also increase pilot casualties to unacceptable levels? The Navy's Operational Analysis Division ran the numbers using data from attacks between July and October 1943. They compared casualty rates and hit rates for standard altitude drops versus low altitude drops. The results were counterintuitive but decisive. Standard altitude drops from 150 feet resulted in aircraft loss rates of approximately 18% per attack and hit rates of approximately 22%. That meant for every 100 torpedoes dropped, you'd lose 18 aircraft and hit 22 targets. Low-altitude drops from 50 feet resulted in aircraft loss rates of approximately 23% per attack, but hit rates of approximately 67%. For every 100 torpedoes dropped, you'd lose 23 aircraft but hit 67 targets. The analysis went deeper. When you factored in the value of sinking or damaging enemy ships versus the cost of losing aircraft and crews, Low-altitude tactics produced a dramatically better exchange ratio. You lost slightly more aircraft per attack, but you accomplished 3 times as many mission objectives. And since the primary goal of a torpedo bomber was to sink ships, not to survive, the mathematics clearly favored the low-altitude approach. There was another factor the analysis revealed. Low-altitude attacks were actually safer in the long run because they shortened the war. Every Japanese cruiser sunk was a cruiser that couldn't shell American positions or threaten supply lines. Every carrier damaged was a carrier that couldn't launch strikes against American ships. The faster the Japanese Navy was destroyed, the fewer attacks American pilots would have to fly, overall. 5 more dangerous attacks now meant 50 fewer attacks later. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical shift created unexpected problems. Training pilots for low-altitude attacks required specialized instruction that standard carrier qualification programs didn't include. The Navy established a torpedo tactics school at Naval Air Station Kaneohe in Hawaii, where experienced pilots like Cruz could train incoming squadrons before they deployed to the combat zones. The school's curriculum was brutal. Pilots would spend 2 weeks flying practice attacks against maneuvering destroyers in the waters off Oahu. The destroyers had orders to maneuver realistically and to operate their anti-aircraft directors as if under actual attack, tracking the incoming aircraft with radar and optical rangefinders. The only concession to safety was that the destroyers didn't actually fire their guns. Students quickly learned that 50 feet was very different from 150 feet. At 150 feet, you had a cushion. If you misjudged your altitude slightly, you still had time to correct. At 50 feet, there was no cushion. Student pilots were constantly overcorrecting, dropping too low and then pulling up in panic, then dropping again. The instructors called it porpoising, and it was the mark of a pilot who hadn't yet internalized the altitude. The breakthrough came when instructors stopped teaching altitude as a number and started teaching it as a feeling. Don't watch your altimeter during the attack run. Watch the water. Learn what 50 feet looks like from the cockpit. Learn to judge height by the texture of the waves, by the perspective of the horizon, by the way your engine sound reflects off the ocean surface. Let your brain's spatial awareness handle the altitude while your conscious mind focuses on navigation, target tracking, and release timing. Pilots who could internalize the 50-foot feeling could maintain it indefinitely without thinking about it. Their hindbrain would scream warnings if they dropped below 45 feet or climbed above 55, but as long as they stayed in that narrow band, they could focus entirely on the attack itself. By November 1943, every torpedo squadron in the Pacific Fleet had transitioned to low-altitude tactics as their primary attack method. Standard altitude drops were still taught and used in situations where low approaches weren't practical, such as attacks through heavy cloud cover or in rough seas where wave heights made 50-foot flying suicidal. But given a choice, pilots universally preferred the low approach because it produced results. The Japanese noticed. Intelligence reports from late 1943 show increasing Japanese awareness that American torpedo tactics had changed. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine had assumed torpedo bombers would attack from 150 feet or higher, and their gun directors were calibrated for those altitudes. When American Avengers started coming in at 50 feet, Japanese gunners found their pre-calculated firing solutions were worthless. The Japanese attempted to adapt. They lowered their anti-aircraft gun elevations and trained gunners to engage targets at masthead height. But this created a new problem. Guns pointed horizontally had much less range than guns pointed upward. A 25mm machine cannon could engage a target at 3,000 yards if the target was at 150 feet altitude. The same gun could only engage out to about 800 yards against a target at 50 feet because the ocean surface blocked the gun's line of sight. That meant Japanese ships had roughly 1/3 the defensive range against low-altitude torpedo attacks compared to standard attacks. American pilots were getting inside the defensive envelope before the guns could effectively engage them, dropping their torpedoes, and climbing away before the concentrated fire could track them accurately. The Japanese tried deploying additional escort destroyers specifically positioned to intercept low-altitude torpedo attacks. The theory was that destroyers stationed 5,000 yards out from the main formation could engage torpedo bombers before they reached release range. In practice, this spread the defensive formation so thin that dive bombers could attack the main ships without interference. The Japanese were being forced to choose between defending against torpedoes and defending against bombs, and American strike coordinators were ruthlessly exploiting that dilemma. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the cumulative effect of these tactical changes. American carrier aircraft attacked the Japanese mobile fleet using coordinated strikes that combined dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters in precisely timed sequences. The torpedo bombers came in at 50 feet from multiple directions simultaneously, while dive bombers attacked from 14,000 feet. Japanese combat air patrols were overwhelmed trying to defend against threats at two altitudes. Japanese anti-aircraft crews couldn't effectively engage both the high-altitude dive bombers and the low-altitude torpedo bombers. The result was devastation. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk in a single afternoon, and the Japanese naval aviation capability was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The irony wasn't lost on American naval historians. At Midway in June 1942, American torpedo bombers attacking at low altitude had been slaughtered while achieving almost nothing. 2 years later at the Philippine Sea, American torpedo bombers attacking at even lower altitudes were achieving unprecedented success with acceptable losses. The difference wasn't the courage of the pilots. The men flying Devastators at Midway had been just as brave as the men flying Avengers at the Philippine Sea. The difference was aircraft capability, fighter support, enemy pilot quality, and most critically, refined tactics that had been developed through hard experience and careful analysis. Cruise's 50-foot drop technique was part of a larger evolution in carrier warfare that turned the torpedo bomber from a liability into a war-winning weapon system. By late 1944, Japanese surface forces had learned to fear American torpedo attacks more than any other threat. Dive bombers were dangerous, but ships could survive bomb hits if their damage control teams were competent. Torpedoes cracked hulls below the waterline, flooded engine rooms, and broke keels. A single torpedo hit could mission kill a cruiser. 2 hits would usually sink it. And with American pilots dropping from 50 feet with hit rates above 60%, every torpedo attack was a near-certain death sentence for at least one ship in the formation. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was significant. Sailors on ships knew that when American torpedo bombers appeared, there was virtually no chance of evading the attack. You could shoot down some of the attackers, but the ones that got through would hit you. That knowledge affected morale in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Japanese destroyer captains began refusing to escort missions in contested waters. Japanese cruiser commanders started requesting transfers to shore duty. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 saw the final evolution of low-altitude torpedo tactics. American carrier aircraft from multiple task groups converged on the Japanese center force in the Sibuyan Sea. The attacks lasted throughout the day, wave after wave of coordinated strikes, hitting the Japanese battleships and cruisers. The super battleship Musashi, sister ship to the famous Yamato, was the primary target. The ship was the most heavily armored warship ever built, designed to survive anything the enemy could throw at it. Over the course of 4 hours, Musashi was hit by 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. The torpedo hits came almost exclusively from low-altitude drops, 50 feet or less, with release ranges between 600 and 1,000 yards. Musashi's anti-aircraft batteries shot down some attackers, but the sheer volume of coordinated attacks overwhelmed the defenses. Torpedo after torpedo slammed into the battleship's hull below the waterline. The ship's armor could withstand the explosions, but it couldn't prevent the flooding. Compartment after compartment filled with water. Damage control teams couldn't keep up with the inflow. At approximately 7:15 p.m., Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. It was the first time in history that aircraft alone had sunk a battleship of that size in open ocean against a fully alert and defending target. The super battleship that was supposed to be unsinkable had been destroyed by torpedo bombers flying at altitudes so low that observers on nearby ships couldn't see them until they were almost directly overhead. The tactical lessons were clear. Armor couldn't save you from coordinated low-altitude torpedo attacks. Speed couldn't save you because you didn't have time to maneuver. Fighter cover couldn't save you because the attackers were too close, too fast, and attacking from too many directions. The only defense was to not be there when the attack came, which meant avoiding American carrier aircraft entirely. By early 1945, the Japanese Navy had effectively conceded the surface battle. Major warships rarely left port without overwhelming fighter cover, and even then, they operated primarily at night when American carrier aircraft couldn't attack. The Battle of Okinawa in April 1945 saw the super battleship Yamato sortied on a one-way mission with just enough fuel to reach Okinawa and beach herself as a stationary gun platform. She never made it. American carrier aircraft found her on April 7th and subjected her to the same treatment Musashi had received. Yamato absorbed at least 12 torpedo hits, almost all from low-altitude drops. The battleship rolled over and sank in 2 hours. Of her crew of 2,700 men, only 280 survived. It was the end of the battleship era, killed not by superior battleships, but by torpedo bombers that had learned to drop their weapons from altitudes measured in feet rather than hundreds of feet. The human cost of this tactical evolution is worth examining. Between July 1943, when crews first demonstrated the 50-foot drop technique, and August 1945, when the war ended, American torpedo squadrons flew thousands of attack missions using low-altitude tactics. The casualty statistics show approximately 2,300 torpedo bomber crew members were killed in action during this period. That's 2,300 men who climbed into their aircraft knowing they were going to fly at 50 feet toward ships that were actively trying to kill them. Some died from anti-aircraft fire. Some died from fighter attacks. Some died from operational accidents, flying into the water because they misjudged their altitude by 10 feet. And some died from blast damage when their own torpedoes detonated too close to their aircraft. But those 2,300 deaths have to be measured against what they accomplished. American torpedo bombers sank or crippled over 300 Japanese warships between mid-1943 and the end of the war. 3 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 18 cruisers, 37 destroyers, and over 240 transports and auxiliary vessels. Each ship sunk was a ship that couldn't threaten American forces, couldn't carry supplies to Japanese garrisons, couldn't project power across the Pacific. The strategic impact was multiplicative. Sinking a cruiser didn't just remove one cruiser from the Japanese order of battle. It forced the Japanese to deploy additional escorts for remaining ships, tied up shipyard resources attempting repairs, and reduced the offensive capability of the entire fleet. The destruction of the Japanese merchant marine by submarines and aircraft starved Japan's war economy, making it impossible to sustain military operations. From a coldly analytical perspective, the exchange ratio was extraordinarily favorable. 2,300 American casualties, inflicted losses on the Japanese Navy that directly contributed to Japan's strategic defeat. You can argue about whether any individual life was worth that trade, but strategically, the mathematics are undeniable. Low-altitude torpedo tactics worked because they turned torpedo bombers from ineffective weapons with 20% hit rates into devastating ship killers with 67% hit rates. The personal stories behind the statistics are harder to quantify but equally important. Lieutenant Howard Cruz survived the war. He flew 42 combat missions, was credited with sinking 2 cruisers and damaging a carrier, and received the Navy Cross for his actions at Kula Gulf. After the war, he stayed in the Navy, transitioned to jet aircraft, and eventually retired as a captain in 1963. He died in 1998 at age 78, having lived long enough to see his tactical innovations become part of the standard curriculum at the Naval Academy. But for every cruise who survived and thrived, there were dozens of pilots who didn't make it home. Ensign Robert Mitchell flew his first low-altitude attack mission in November 1943 and was shot down on his 3rd mission while attacking a destroyer in the Marshall Islands. He was 19 years old. Lieutenant James Harwood survived 16 missions before his Avenger took a direct hit from a 5-inch shell during an attack on a Japanese convoy. His aircraft exploded in mid-air. He was 23. These men knew the risks. They'd been trained extensively on what could go wrong during low-altitude attacks. They understood that flying at 50 feet gave them almost no margin for error, and that anti-aircraft fire at that range was often fatal if it connected. They flew anyway because the mission required it, and because they believed their sacrifice meant something. The broader lesson from the 50-foot drop technique extends beyond World War II torpedo tactics. It's about the relationship between risk and effectiveness in military operations. Standard doctrine often represents a compromise between effectiveness and survivability. You accept lower success rates in exchange for higher survival rates because keeping your forces alive is strategically valuable. But sometimes that compromise costs more lives in the long run than accepting higher short-term risks. If the Devastator pilots at Midway had been able to use 50-foot drops with working torpedoes and adequate fighter cover, they might have sunk Japanese carriers instead of being annihilated. The losses would have been high regardless, but at least those losses would have accomplished something beyond creating a diversion for the dive bombers. The development of low-altitude tactics required someone like Cruz who was willing to question standard doctrine and test alternatives. The Navy's institutional response could have gone either way. They could have court-martialed him for violating safety protocols. Instead, they recognized that his innovation worked, studied why it worked, and systematically implemented it across the fleet. That institutional flexibility was one of the American military's significant advantages in World War II. The Japanese military was notoriously rigid in its doctrine, rarely adapting tactics even when those tactics were clearly failing. The Germans were more flexible but often couldn't implement changes quickly enough because their industrial base was strained. The Americans had both the flexibility to recognize effective innovations and the industrial capacity to exploit them. By 1945, American torpedo bombers were using tactics that would have been considered suicidal in 1942. They were flying lower, closer, and more aggressively than any pre-war doctrine would have permitted, and they were achieving success rates that pre-war analysts would have thought impossible. The Japanese surrender in August 1945 ended the Pacific War before all the implications of low-altitude tactics could be fully explored. The Navy had been developing new techniques for attacking anchored ships in harbors, experiments with skip bombing using torpedoes, and coordinated attacks involving submarines and aircraft working together. The war ended before those innovations saw combat use. In the post-war period, the advent of jet aircraft and guided missiles made torpedo bombing increasingly obsolete. Modern anti-ship missiles could be launched from dozens of miles away, well outside the range of defensive fire. Why risk flying at 50 feet toward a target when you could fire a missile from 50 miles and let the missile do the dangerous part? But the fundamental lesson remained relevant. Sometimes the most effective approach is the most dangerous approach. Sometimes you need to get closer than doctrine says is safe. Sometimes orthodoxy is just another word for playing it safe, and playing it safe means accepting mediocre results. The 50-foot drop technique represented a specific solution to a specific tactical problem in a specific historical moment. But the mindset behind it, the willingness to question assumptions and test alternatives, even when those alternatives seemed insane, that mindset is timeless. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.